All right. I think we're at some good numbers here, so I think we can get going today. I want to welcome everybody who has hopped in. Those of you who are just joining us, want to welcome you to the third in the Quantcast INNOVATE webinar series. So appreciate everyone coming today and donating some of your remote time. Today's a topic that we've received a lot of interest from, both internally at Quantcast and from partners we speak with across the industry, closing the measurement gap in digital marketing. So real quickly, my name is Taylor Core. I'll be the host and moderator today. I've been with Quantcast a little over 6 years. I currently head up our inside sales team. We're responsible for client direct and independent agency partnerships in North America. Just to set the stage for today, coming your way soon, there'll be a 45-minute presentation from our own Dr. Peter Day. And then at the end, there'll be 15 minutes of Q&A. So I really encourage everyone to drop your questions in the Zoom. I'll be monitoring those questions at the end. Looking forward to having a really rich discussion on this important topic. Guessing some of you are already familiar with Quantcast. Some of you are new. Some of you might need a refresher. So for everyone today, Quantcast is an audience intelligence and measurement company headquartered in San Francisco. We combine machine learning, a privacy by design approach, and live data drawn from over 100 million online destinations. We then use all that information to provide data, software, and information advertising services for marketers, publishers, and advertising agencies worldwide. Today, we're operating in 10 countries and have over 20 offices globally. From Peter Day, as I mentioned, and as Chief Technology Officer at Quantcast, Peter's responsible for the development of products which allow marketers and publishers to help make smart choices about buying and selling effective advertising. Prior to joining Quantcast, Peter spent 12 years in the financial industry, and he also has a PhD in machine learning. He's been an incredible partner internally for us, helping us build great products at Quantcast. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter.
Thank you, Taylor. And thank you everyone for joining to hear me talk about this topic. A little bit about me, and the reason I'm telling you about me is because it's going to be important for the first half of this presentation. I was born, as we all were, I did a PhD in machine learning, and then I spent a large portion of my career in financial markets before joining Quantcast in 2016. And I want to start today with a story. A long time ago, well, not quite a long time ago, let's say about 500 years ago in London, this is what financial markets look like. Financial markets were a lot of the transactions in financial markets actually happen in coffee houses, right? And what you were really doing in financial markets at this point is you were getting a bit of paper that gave you a share in something like a voyage out to the new world, right? And it was very, very much relationship and trust based. All of the deals were typically done with people that you already knew, right? And this is how financial markets operated, and this is how large kind of expeditions and things were kind of funded. This was really powerful, really interesting, and arguably this is a little bit about, it looks a lot like how kind of media agencies worked not that long ago. Very much relationship driven. Okay, they weren't doing deals in coffee houses, it was in restaurants and maybe in bars, but it was very much relationship driven, very much trust driven. And the financial markets kind of evolved over the hundreds of years that kind of followed. And for a long time, they still worked at kind of human speed. And to be honest, even back in the 1950s and 60s, there was very much a kind of small club of people who worked at human speed, and it was very much relationship driven and trust driven. And then something happened in the 1970s when the first fully digital exchange was kind of launched, the NASDAQ. It was the first kind of financial exchange that had no physical presence, no one shouting at each other, no personal relationships. And all of a sudden we moved into this new era of data-driven trading. Now, as often happens, and we see it all the time, while the only constant in life is change, the rate of change is not constant. Right, we tend to find, be it in evolution or in financial markets or in industry, we go through these periods where the environment has changed and all of a sudden there's a rapid evolution. Right, and we saw this in financial markets. So if you look at like 1970, before the kind of dawn of kind of data-driven trading, this is what was called the bulge bracket. These were the big investment banks. They're a little bit like the big six, but for financial markets. And now it looks very different. Right, so during these periods of change, there's a real opportunity for kind of companies to kind of thrive, and it tends to be the people who tend to thrive during these periods tend to be the most agile. But that's not what I'm here to tell you about today. Something else happens during this time as well. Simple markets became complex markets. All of a sudden, this digitization of trading enabled new products to come along. Things that simply were not possible before could suddenly happen. The role of a trader was no longer building a relationship and shouting out a price. All of a sudden, they had to do something fundamentally different. Making sense of this rapidly changing world was very hard in financial markets, and people's jobs had to fundamentally change between about the late 70s and the early 2000s. And complex financial products emerged in this time. This is something I worked in, and some of you will actually know far more about this than you would have done, pre-2010. I'll talk about that in a little while. But these kind of new financial products simply were not possible before the digitization of banking and financial markets emerged. This is a good example of one. This is something called a mortgage-backed security. We end up with people over here buying houses. They're basically going to a bank and getting a mortgage to buy a property. Where does the bank get money from? Well, traditionally, it was from people depositing money. But investment banks came up with a smart way of kind of facilitating the movement of capital. They pooled up these mortgages, this debt from all of these home buyers down here into a large pool to make it worth a lot of money. They pass it through some kind of rules to kind of split it into what they call tranches. So they have these bonds against this pool of mortgages, which are going to pay out to investors. And they put super safe stuff at the top. So they basically say, we're going to pay you guys off first. And then gradually have these different tranches where people can invest at whatever risk premium they want. This financial model of taking an illiquid asset, such as a mortgage, bundling it up, putting it through some magic in the middle to be able to attract investment over here, enabled a hell of a lot of movement of capital from investors, from insurance companies, from banks, and so on and so forth, into things like the mortgage markets. Right? This is a fundamentally new product that was only possible with the digitization of financial markets. Now, making sense of all this is really, really hard. This handsome chap here. This was me when I was working in financial markets. I have no idea why I've got my hand up against my face like this. I promise I didn't walk around like that all the time. I actually looked at the geotagging on this photo. It was taken in some bar in Hong Kong. So I don't really know what the context is here. But this was me back then, and I'm trying to make sense of this complicated world, right? How do we, as an investment bank, kind of issue this stuff? And as an investor, how do I know what to invest in? There were thousands of these things coming up all the time. And what happened was this. In order to allow investors to work out where to place their money, there was far too many options for them to do that. And so everything got reduced to some single metrics. We ended up with something called a rating, which is supposed to be, how safe is this investment? AAA, it is super safe. It's pretty much like investing in a government bond. How long is my money tied up for, my term, my 4-year, and what interest rate am I going to get back? Right, so all of these complex financial products suddenly got reduced basically to 3 bits of information. How safe is it, this rating, which was given by an independent, I use the word independent in inverted quotes there, in inverted commas there. Well, this part of this transaction is super safe. How long is it? It has my percentage. Then all of a sudden, I don't have to worry about all that stuff behind it. These complex, all these thousands of mortgages and homeowner, people who borrowed against their homes, the collateral in terms of how much the property does. I can just reduce everything to the AAA rating, term, and yield, and then I can easily compare and contrast. Right. So this enables me as an investor to make informed decisions about where to put my money. Unfortunately, this did not pay off too well. I believe one of the fundamental causes of the 2008 financial crisis, and I was there at the front of it, feeling the pain, I looked a lot like this for many, many weeks on end, was because we had reduced all of the complexity of people buying houses, often not necessarily being able to afford to pay for those houses, into 3 simple metrics. AAA rated, how long it is, and what the yield is. So, in retrospect, what did I learn from this? The first thing I learned from this is that aggregate metrics hide a lot of sins. When I look back, it feels like we were doing this inside both investment banks and investors. We had a lot of people all looking at the same thing. Not seeing the forest for the trees is an understatement. Everyone is just looking at all these AAA rated bonds and exactly what percentage yield we could get. Was it 4.21% or 4.211%? Right? It's as if we were all just spending all of our time just looking and analyzing this single tree here, and we were ignoring everything else around it. These aggregate metrics, such as a AAA rating and a yield and a term, hide the fact that people were giving loans to people who couldn't afford them, and they weren't even having to make a payment for the first year. It ignored the fact that property prices had just been going up and up and up, largely enabled by the fact that lots of people could borrow against property, and it didn't consider the fact that all of a sudden people could walk away from their homes and that could cause a crash. Right? But we were all obsessed with a rating, a yield, and a term. The second thing that I learned in retrospect is the law of unintended consequences. This is Goodhart's law. When a measure, it was originally about economic policy in the UK, but I think it applies a lot. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a useful measure. Another way of explaining this is something called the Cobra effect. The Cobra effect is a name given to something that allegedly happened in kind of colonial rule India. There was a city in India where they were having a huge issue with snakes. Cobras, I think. They assume that's why it's called the Cobra effect. There are cobras all over the city. And some smart person who was some kind of head of some department, no doubt, in this city, came with a super smart idea. He said, look, we can't afford to go and hire a whole bunch of cobra catchers. Why don't we just pay people to bring us dead cobras? Brilliant idea. All of a sudden it started working. All of a sudden they kind of crowdsourced this, and people all over the city, as soon as they saw a cobra, they'd catch it, they'd kill it, they'd bring it in, and they'd get a fee for it. Brilliant idea. I'm sure this guy was very, very proud of himself. However, very soon, some entrepreneurs in this city decided catching one cobra and getting some cash is fine, but how about I caught 2 cobras and I bred them, and all of a sudden I've got as many dead cobras as I want. And this is exactly what happened. And all of a sudden they're turning up every day with these dead cobras, collecting their fee. Of course, the authorities caught on to this fairly quickly. It was fairly obvious to see what was going on, lots of baby cobras, until they ended the scheme straight away. At which point, all of these cobra breeders had no use for their cobras anymore. They unleashed them, and the problem at the end of this policy was worse than the beginning. There were more cobras on the streets. Right? The Cobra effect is a name given to these unintended consequences. The measurement that you sets incentives, people will optimize towards that. Right? It's very, very real. It was very real in financial markets as we started pumping a whole bunch of money into mortgages. Investment banks, and I was there working in investment banks at the time, we were incentivized to get as much deal flow as possible, which meant get as much cash as we possibly can from investors into the mortgage markets, and we did that, and we printed all of this paper constantly. Ultimately, that resulted in massive global recession. The third thing that I think about in retrospect is I just wish I'd applied some common sense. When I was sat there at various investment banks, but most recently UBS, I wish I'd just taken a step back and just looked at it. What the hell is going on here? So how does all of this relate to digital marketing? So the first thing I want to address when we talk about measurement today is, why do you measure? And I think there's 3 reasons that we measure in digital marketing. The first reason for measurement is kind of budget justification. We want to justify to somebody, typically someone who's a CFO, what's the return on investment? And I have to do this with our CFO, who's wonderful, and all CFOs are wonderful and scary in kind of equal measure. And you have to go and say, well, look, next year I need this much cash for marketing. And they want to know what's the return on investment. Ultimately, they need a balance sheet for the company, and they need to know, I put this in, I get this out. So the first reason that people want to measure is they want some sort of return on investment. Now that is hard for marketing, and nobody has ever convinced me they've done anything other than use kind of broad heuristics. The best approach, and this might sound odd coming from someone who's right in the weeds of digital marketing, but the best approach I've seen for how much to spend on marketing overall and working out your rough return on investment is to kind of use these kind of finger in the air heuristics, what vertical you're in, what scale of business you are, where you want to get to, these kind of things. And that will kind of broadly tell you how much you need to invest in marketing. And I know this is true because you look at balance sheets of public listed companies and they're pretty similar in terms of their investment, in terms of their plans. Right? The second reason that people want to measure is budget allocation. Okay, I've agreed with my CFO, usually on an annual basis, by the way. I only agree this with our CFO now. There might be a bit of an upweight and downweight quarter by quarter, depending on how things are going, but the major decision is once a year. The budget allocation problem, it obviously happens a little bit more often, usually quarterly, if I'm honest. And these are big questions like brand versus performance. And again, measuring brand and performance, you can do big longitudinal studies, but again, people generally use heuristics. They generally use things like, the paper that was the long and the short of it about should it be 60-40 or 40-60, and what channels do I use? Again, you're making these decisions about once a quarter. You might be adjusting them once a month or so on and so forth. But that budget allocation problem is also a reason that people like to measure. And then there's the third reason that people measure, which is this continual improvement. I've allocated my budget to try and achieve these types of goals. And then how do I make sure that I continually iterate within that channel to make it better and better and better? And ideally, this is the most rapid area of decision making. I think there's been a misstep in digital marketing with trying to get one metric that can satisfy all of these use cases. I think that is a little bit crazy to try and have the same metrics used for top level ROI that your CFO could use to the type of metric that you need on the ground every day to make sure that you're using that budget most effectively. I'd also argue that by far the most important set of metrics to use are for this area here. Because if you're off by 10% in any of these two areas, based on these heuristics, but you're doing an awesome job at continual improvement, as in within this channel and with this goal, we're able to optimize and make it better and better week over day, week over week, month over month, you'll still get some outcomes. If you optimize purely for justification and allocation on those metrics, you may well optimize towards the wrong things. You will not be able to compare and contrast, and you'll not be able to make the best use of any channel or for any goal. So today, I'm going to be focusing on the metrics used down here for your continual improvement. Where are we? Yeah, so I do think, I've already stated this, but I forgot which order of my slides are going to come in. I do think there has been this search in digital marketing for the holy grail of digital measurement, which really basically says there's one number that could fit in our balance sheet, do our budget allocation, and do the continual improvement. That to me feels like this. It feels like we're all staring at this single metric and we're missing the wood for the trees. When I spoke to somebody in preparation for this call in an agency about the types of metrics they were using for continual improvement, they talked about execution metrics, performance metrics, hygiene metrics, and they gave me a whole list of all this kind of stuff. None of which I have any issue with, but I do think it's important when we think about continual improvement, we think about this beautiful cycle, right? Continual improvement is really, your rate of forward progress is directly proportional to how quickly you can iterate, which in turn is how can I get from an idea to an execution to a measurement and then go again. Right, that's really your rate of forward progress. I talk about this a lot at Quantcast. We talk a lot about removing all the obstacles we can to make sure we can iterate as fast as possible so that we can test and learn, test and learn, test and learn. Right, and measurement in this needs to tell you two things. It needs to tell you, firstly, did I execute what I thought I executed okay? Because you need to know that you executed your plan or your idea, because otherwise, if it works or it doesn't work, you have no idea as to whether that's because it was your idea and it was the right one or the wrong one, or it was just you executed it well or badly. Right. So the first thing you need to measure is, okay, did I execute what I thought I executed? And the second thing is it impacting anything? Those are the two things that really matter when it comes to measurement for the purpose of continual improvement. Now, I want to talk quickly about clicks. I get asked a lot about clicks a lot of the time. Clicks are interesting metrics, partly because they're easy to measure. One of the missteps that we have taken in digital marketing is to obsess with what's measurable rather than measuring what is of value. Clicks are incredibly easy to measure. They're incredibly easy to measure. They work without things like without third cookies. I'd argue that in some channels they kind of work. So if I look at things like a search, if I go to any search engine, but let's be honest, most of us go to Google. If we go to a search engine, I search something, I'm going there with the express intent of clicking. Like almost all searches, unless I'm using it as a calculator or something like that, generally I'm going to Google to click on something. That is my exact intent as I go there. And so kind of measuring clicks can kind of make some sense. If I'm in a different environment, if I'm reading some content, or if I'm watching a movie and see an ad, I'm not there to go and immediately click on something else. That's not my intent. And so clicks can be useful in some contexts. I'd still argue that they're not the metric people think they are. A lot of, between 30 and 70% of clicks, depending on who you listen to, on Google at least, are navigational, as in I can't be bothered to type in the web address, but they're still kind of useful in that context. However, there is a Cobra effect in action here. When people incentivize towards clicks, when marketers incentivize towards clicks, it's very much like they're incentivizing towards picking up dead cobras. What has happened as a result of this? Well, we've ended up with a lot of clickbait. A lot of these sites where almost all the things you can accidentally click on, and these are actually not too bad examples of this, but even sites really trick you into accidentally clicking. You are buying these dead cobras, and over time, the market has to respond to the way it's being measured, and so we end up with clickbait in the best instance, or we end up with content split over multiple pages where one of the next buttons actually takes you through to an article, and we also end up with bots, right? Because bots click on everything by design. Right, so we always need to be aware. What we measure sets incentives, remember the Cobra effect, and certainly when we measure only on clicks, if we incentivize on clicks, ultimately this has actually transformed the internet. It is not as bad now simply because, this was a few years ago, there was clickbait everywhere, simply because marketers have changed the way they measure. They have stopped paying for dead cobras. Also, almost every study will tell you with open web advertising, almost all your clickers are not your converters. The same is true, these kind of weaknesses and these unintended consequences are true with even things like hygiene metrics, right? So recently, I guess it's been the last, 4 years now, everyone's wanting to measure viewability. It kind of makes sense. It's a nice hygiene metric to have. Your ad should be seen. Why would you pay for an ad that's never seen? It does have some weaknesses. It does have some unintended consequences. And I think it's really important when you look at metrics like viewability to remember Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a useful measure. It does make sense to measure viewability. But if you set some arbitrary goal that 80% of your ads or 70% of your ads must be viewed, you all of a sudden end up with some unintended consequences. The first one is that you massively restrict the available inventory to you. Now, this is the kind of at bid time, what you think the likelihood of something being viewed is. All of a sudden, 75% of the available inventory is unavailable to you. Moreover, because over recent years, many large agencies have decided that they want 80% of brand ads to be viewable and 60% of performance ads to be viewable, there's a huge amount of competition for this inventory here, which means all this stuff is a lot cheaper. And it is irrational from an economic perspective to spend 3 times as much on an ad that is 60% likely to be viewed than it is to spend a third of that on one that's 40% likely to be viewed. But by setting these arbitrary targets, this hygiene metric has become a target, and it's meant that all this inventory up here is super expensive and highly competitive, and a huge opportunity to take advantage of all this other inventory. That doesn't mean it's not going to be seen, it just means it's less likely, but it's a lot cheaper for you. So it has that unintended consequence. More importantly, and this happens slower, it's also started to shape the internet. If you look at this page here, all of these ads are 100% viewable. That is the content on the page. And we're starting to see publishers respond to the fact that they need to have high viewability rates by doing things like lazy loading ads, shoving all the ads at the top of the page, doing all these other kind of tricks, again, to respond to the way they're measured. So as we start looking at any metrics, it's really important to remember the Cobra effect and the unintended consequences that they might have. So I'm going to move now on to how do you measure success? As in, how do you answer the question, is it having an impact? Approaches to measuring success. And broadly, there's 2 approaches: attribution, what touch points are associated with the consumer conversion. This assigns some sort of numeric value to key touch points on a customer journey that led to a sale. and incrementality. I'm going to focus today on performance measurement just because I think it's easier. Brand measurement is something that we'll cover in a future webinar. The second one is incrementality. Is my advertising causal? Right? So starting with attribution. It might seem like the perfect metric because it's beautifully quantifiable. You end up with metrics like cost per acquisition, cost per lead, return on ad spend, this kind of stuff. These are metrics that my CFO desperately wants to hear all the time. There are some weaknesses. I'll touch on some of those in a second. The nice thing is it does tie your marketing spend to results, and it legitimizes, again, to your CFO that you're spending money wisely. It does have some threats as well. The big question you're trying to answer with attribution is who's responsible. When Sarah goes ahead and buys something, I can't remember what she buys in my beautiful animation here, but let's say she goes and buys something, her customer journey is messy. All customer journeys are messy. Right? And so what is responsible? Who do I attribute this sale to? Which of these many different partners do I say, hey, they were responsible so I can give them that conversion or give them a share of that conversion? That's a hard problem. And we have these things called attribution models, and even simple attribution models have these parameters. Right? So even just a simple attribution model, you need to assign when there's multiple ways that someone's got information, how do I assign credit? Do I give it to the first person who reached someone? Do I give it to the last? Do I say anyone who touched them, I'm going to give them an equal share of portion? Do I fractionally assign it? And then how long do I consider for my look back windows, my view through window, my click through window? Now, a simple attribution model has all of these different parameters. And the other night, very late in the night, I decided I was going to demonstrate the challenge with this by messing with some of these parameters on a single day for a single campaign to work out how many conversions were attributed. So I just messed with the parameters for this model, and these were all different numbers of conversions that were attributed. It went from 12 here, which I think that was kind of click only, very short look back window, to 491. So I only messed with a couple of parameters here. Which of these is the correct number? How many conversions did this advertising campaign drive? I'm not going to ask you, there's far too many of you to kind of put your hands up. They're all wrong. Of course they're all wrong. Of course they're all wrong. There's all sorts of problems with attribution. Attribution is very sensitive to model parameters. It's undercounting a lot of conversions due to cookie churn. People think, well, I've got a 45-day look back window, but half the cookies we see are less than a day old anyway. You know, it's and they're overcounting because correlation is not causation. You know, showing ads to Sarah when she's already at the checkout page is probably not causal. She was probably going to go ahead and buy anyway. Now, so before you all go and weep and cry, there's a great quote. Oh, other challenges with this, by the way, when I talk about attribution and undercounting, if only a tiny fraction of the internet today has cookie coverage over about 3 weeks, you know, and about half of it has no cookie coverage at all, you know, of course, we're going to start seeing that some of our attribution models over a long time period are going to have some issues. You can solve this by, in fact, I'll come back to that in a second. But the main point I want to make is that this is a great quote by one of the statisticians who's arguably one of the most influential statisticians of the 20th century. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Please don't think that these metrics are completely useless, but do understand that the model's wrong. None of these numbers, in terms of the numbers of conversions, are correct. Doesn't mean those numbers can't be useful. I personally really like simple models for measurement, particularly things like attribution, because with a simple model, I can kind of understand its weaknesses. I understand how to interpret it. I understand what it's sensitive to. So, you know, I understand that if I have, you know, really short look back windows, and I do want a last touch, then of course, anyone who's kind of scalping credit off the top by doing some aggressive retargeting is going to look, and I can kind of keep an eye out for that, right? So simple models are good. As soon as models become more and more complex, one of the approaches that depressingly digital marketers have tried to do to kind of get over this problem is come up with more complicated models to be able to come up with the one right answer, to pick one of these or come up with yet another number in terms of the number of conversions. When we start adding complexity to this, it becomes too hard to reason about. I don't know what, you know, where it can go wrong. I don't know the weaknesses in that model. So when we start thinking about things like attribution, Please remember that the attribution model is wrong. Reducing it to a single metric might be appealing because it looks good to your CFO, but every model has flaws, and the simpler the model, the easier it is to understand its potential flaws. This is why I don't like, to be honest, all these big, complex, multi-touch attribution with regression and all this other kind of stuff, because I think it's missing the point. It's trying to reduce something as complicated as seeing if you're influencing a group of people to take different actions into a single metric. And as soon as that model becomes super complex, very difficult to reason about, very difficult to understand the risks of the model, and therefore it becomes next to useless, and it's very, very black box. Here's an example of yet more complexity on in terms of things like attribution. This view here is conversion rate. Now, personally, I prefer conversion rate to something like a CPA. And the reason I prefer conversion rate to cost per acquisition is because people don't suddenly pretend they ultimately understand how much it's costing them to get a consumer. You don't jump into that trap of thinking, okay, well, I've got an exact dollar amount I need to get a new customer. Conversion rate kind of moves you away from that. And this is an example of, even with one different parameter, we see conversion rates shift massively. This is where we use either third-party cookie information or probabilistic information to look at conversion rates between different environments. We can see over time, this green line here is conversion rate on Safari. When we adjust that using probabilistic information to correlate events with seeing an ad and something else, we can see that the conversion rate shifts up massively on Safari and it doesn't move much on Chrome. So there are so many different parameters to something as simple as a cost per acquisition or return on ad spend or a conversion rate. And your model is very sensitive to that. So what are the recommendations for attribution? The first one is just to apply common sense. Always, as I wish I'd done in financial markets, what is it actually doing, right? What should I expect to happen? It kind of makes sense that my conversion rate with good advertising should be similar between Safari and Chrome. It kind of makes sense that if I'm doing some very aggressive retargeting, I expect to do some overcounting there, because some of that stuff are people who are going to buy anyway. It kind of makes sense that as I look over a longer time horizon, I'm going to end up with less visibility. So understanding and applying common sense to this is really important. Second thing is, look at shapes, not numbers, and directional, not absolute. What I mean by this is aggregate numbers, such as a AAA rating on a bond that happens to have weird mortgages behind it, or an individual CPA number, can hide a whole bunch of things. Same as an average frequency number. It hides the reality. So look at the shapes, not the individual numbers, and look for directional signals, better or worse. The relative comparison is fine. Don't look at absolute numbers and, well, this person only cost me $20 to acquire, therefore I can get another one for $20. Directional tactics are really useful for that continual improvement. Is this tactic working or not? Does this creative work with this audience better or worse? Directional numbers are really, really useful. And as part of that, I think it's really important to look at the portfolio for confidence. What I mean by that is, when I think about an advertising campaign, I really think of it as a portfolio of ad impressions. In the same way, these weird bonds over here were really a portfolio of mortgage buyers here. I think it's really important for advertisers to understand that when you're buying an advertising campaign or executing an advertising campaign, what you're really doing is you're buying a portfolio of impressions. So look at that to get some confidence, as I wish we had done in the financial markets. And so to do that, I'm not here to do a product demo today, but I'm going to show you some things that I mean here. I started, in preparation for this, I started running some advertising campaigns for our consent management platform, not spending very much, just because I'm only doing it for the purpose of showing you some measurement stuff. If you're already one of our Q4Marketers customers, apologies, you'll be fully aware of this. If you're yet to be a Q4Marketers customer, you might find this interesting. But if you look at our Insights Lab area, the reason we invented Insights Lab was to allow people to get confidence and understand what was happening with their portfolio. And so again, we're showing distributions and shapes, not individual numbers, because I think it's really important. It's a lot easier to understand what's going on when you don't reduce something to a single metric. So, seeing how far people are coming into your site. If all of a sudden you're seeing a lot of people only getting to page depth 1, then you're probably buying some dodgy traffic. Looking at things like, what else have we got in here? All sorts of stuff. Where are my conversions coming from? Does this make sense? Well, it kind of makes sense. We're selling a consent management platform for publishers. The fact that they're coming from pubfinity.com kind of makes sense. If that has no relationship to my product, that's a bit of a concern. So again, we're just looking at the portfolio here. Even something like funnel visualizers. How am I driving people through my funnel? And metrics like frequency distribution. This looks really nice for a performance campaign. This is performance advertising. We're trying to get somebody and give them an offer to have some sort of explicit call to action. So we don't want to kind of bombard people. If we are running a brand campaign and we're influencing, we don't want to see this frequency distribution. We want most people to see the ad a number of times. So again, look at the portfolio, look at shapes, not individual numbers, because the aggregate numbers often hide a whole bunch of complexity. There's a bunch of other things in here as well. But hopefully you get the idea that without, even things like prospecting, retargeting breakdoan, where am I getting my conversions from? I actually ran another campaign where I deliberately over retargeted. So here the pink bar is prospecting, yellow bar is retargeting, and the purple bar is both, as in we prospected them, they visited the site and then we retargeted them. Where are my conversions coming from? Well, in this case, I deliberately over retargeted on this campaign just to demonstrate. If I saw this, I'd be a little bit worried because this is abnormal. Having to prospect and retarget for this product doesn't make sense, right? So there's clearly some over retargeting happening here. So again, understanding what's happening on your campaign is very much like understanding in 2007 what you're actually investing in terms of the mortgage portfolio. And you'll be pleased to know, if you're our Q for Marketers customers, very soon we're actually going to start alerting you via our fancy new notification system up here when these things start moving around and when we see something slightly unusual, so you can go and dig in and see what's happening and make sure that something odd is not happening there. All right, so where were we? Right, let's skip that slide. Incrementality. Incrementality is the other approach that people take towards measuring performance. And incrementality is a beautiful idea. The idea behind incrementality is I can actually measure the causal impact of my advertising. Is this impact actually causing people to change their decision-making and going ahead and buying something? Now, there are a whole bunch of challenges with effectively running an incrementality test. The only way that science has ever established for measuring the causal impact of something, be this in medicine or chemistry or physics or anything else, the only way that science has ever established for measuring causality is something called the double-blind test. We call them A/B tests. It's where you have a test group and a control group, and you keep everything exactly the same between those two sets of people, two sets, except for one thing. Right? That is a good scientific experiment, and that is the only way in any discipline that we've ever established for measuring causality. But doing that on the open internet is incredibly hard. The first challenge you have is something called publisher inventory bias. Some publishers, if you're doing something like a PSA on one side, so you're buying some charity ads on one side and you're showing a brand ad on the other side, that's the most common and robust way of running an A/B test. But even doing that, you need to be aware of publisher inventory bias. What we mean by that is publishers will block, some will block PSAs, for various reasons, particularly to do with some of the verification vendors, but they will block charity ads. Other publishers will block the brand ad because they might have sold an exclusive share of voice to one of your competitors. Right? So you have this bias there. You need to control for that, otherwise it's not a decent test. The A/B tests go wrong all the time because you're not controlling for that. So you need to be able to somehow make sure that you are restricting your inventory that you're running your A/B test on to ones that accept the ads on both sides. It's a very dynamic space, the open internet. Things change all the time with publishers. This is something you need to constantly adjust to make sure that you're only running ads in areas that accept the A side and the B side, your test and your control. The second problem, especially these days, is the cookie churn problem. The fact that most cookies are short-lived, most advertising takes a little while to have an impact, and therefore you need to restrict your kind of addressable inventory to where you can keep your test and control separate. So you haven't got someone yesterday saw a brand ad and now all of a sudden they're in the group which is seeing the control ad, right? So unfortunately, you're restricting your addressable audience, that portion of the internet where you've got long-lived cookies, so that you can have good hygiene. If you're using cookies, we're now switching over to using probabilistic identifiers for the same reason, but you still need to restrict it to the portion of the internet where you can keep your test and your control groups kind of separate for a long enough period of time. And that period of time will vary depending on your tactics and your brand and your vertical and various other things, but you do need to restrict it again. You're also very exposed to poor or gained benchmarks. People will pitch you all the time. They have a clever way of doing these A/B tests. Don't worry about the science behind it, but we showed amazing incrementality. Be skeptical. And the fourth problem that I've seen in running these incrementality are people are trying to combine complicated attribution with incrementality. That, to me, like they'll be using some complex multi-touch attribution vendor and an A/B test at the same time. I have no idea how to reason about that problem. That, to me, is complete insane. Please keep your attribution as simple as humanly possible. Any touch will do. Otherwise, all of your predictive power of your A/B test goes completely out of the window. So you can solve these problems, publish your inventory bias by adaptive block and allow lists, so constantly updating to restrict your inventory. You can solve the cookie churn problem. You need to experiment on traffic that's trackable so you can keep the test and control separately. You then do, by the way, need to make an assumption that things that you learn during the A/B test that you're running can be extrapolated to the rest of the internet, the rest of the publishers, the rest of the cookies, right? So this is not a perfect test by any means, but as long as, you know, you are making that leap of faith. You do need to validate methodology and execution, right? If someone, and the way I would do it, if anyone's running an A/B test for you, just make sure that things are the same between the two sides. Do what we did with the portfolio metrics earlier. Look at the frequency, look at the delivery, look at all this kind of stuff between the A and B sides to make sure the only thing that's different is seeing a brand ad and a PSA. And on attribution, please keep it super simple. Please don't try and combine some complicated model for assigning credit with an A/B test. It just becomes impossible to kind of reason about at that point. Again, I'm not here to a product pitch today. I'm very proud to tell you though, we are rolling out in our experimental framework, we're making this very soon. All of these problems are solved beautifully by going to an advertising campaign here. Let's find one and clicking this button that says create experiment. And if you tell us it's an incrementality experiment, we will control for publisher bias and all this other kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm not allowed to sell to you today. That's Taylor's job. Okay. So in summary, there's no real holy grail of measurement, by which I mean, if you were trying to come up with a single metric to keep your CFO happy, do kind of cross-channel allocation and optimize on a day-to-day basis, I'm afraid you're not in luck, because what we're trying to do is really hard. Reaching and influencing audiences, cutting through the noise, coming up with some value proposition that can somehow unconsciously and consciously steer their behavior is an incredibly hard thing to do. Reducing that to a single metric, I'm afraid, is like the Holy Grail. Key takeaways from today. Please, aggregate metrics hide reality, context everything. Reducing it to a single metric is the same mistake that financial investors made by reducing complex portfolios of mortgages into a single rating. It's not that rating is not useful, you just need the context. You need the context associated with it. What is this mortgage portfolio? Are they all in Detroit? Right? Remember the purpose of each metric. Please do not try and unify your reporting to your board and your CFO with your execution tactics. And remember, incentives that you set as a marketer and as a cohort of marketers shape the internet. They drive behavior. They change the way that the internet functions, and it's already led to clickbait and to content being distributed over multiple pages, content being pushed down. This is not what you really want. Beware the Cobra effect. Thank you. I hope that was somewhat enlightening and entertaining. I think we've got time for questions.
Yeah, I would call that somewhat enlightening. So mission accomplished. Yeah, I've been here 6.5 years, and I always learn something new hearing Dr. Peter Day go to work. So as a reminder, we do have live Q&A on here. I appreciate Nathan being the brave first volunteer here. Peter's incredibly passionate. He's also very friendly. So, you know, it's a good environment for questions here. I've got some other questions that have been emailed ahead of time, so I'll get to those, but I do want to start with Nathan. So Nathan asks, benchmarks such as industry standards for CTR or open rates for emails are among the most frequently abused digital measurements used by agencies and clients. Are there any common benchmarks or sources for benchmarks that you recommend using or to better establish one that you recommend using, or better to establish one's own benchmarks based on historical performance?
I really like people establishing their own benchmarks. As I say, I think a lot of metrics are about continual improvement. So you care about one tactic versus another. You care about these things over time. I actually really like, we're working at the moment behind the scenes on doing benchmarks per vertical and things, so that you can at least get those in there with some error bars on them. But I actually really think the smart thing to do is establish your own benchmarks. Do that because your goal is continual improvement. You do continual improvement in each channel, you're going to win. This is what smart marketers are doing. It's continually improving all the time. So yeah, I would establish your own benchmarks. I think there's industry benchmarks are just, there's not enough nuance to them for them to be useful. Establish your own. We're working on a kind of per vertical set of benchmarks and things. But again, it depends on the context. Like, you know, the benchmarks you use obviously for kind of basket cart abandonment and recovery are going to be different from driving engaged site visitors and things. So establish your own benchmarks is always my go-to advice.
All right. Shane's got a question here. What is your favorite way to show incremental growth, both in the short term and long term?
That is a tough problem. It really depends on the brand. So with some brands, we've done holdouts, and we've effectively, you know, done the old classic thing that you used to do with out-of-home advertising. So we've had geo holdouts, and we showed higher sales in one geo than another. Certainly, if you're a big brand and you're doing a big push, that's still a pretty smart way to go. Right? Test your messaging. You know, test your cut through within one area and actually see, you know, whether you're getting more customers in that area. So that works really well. A/B tests, if executed well, they can show some incremental kind of value. Trying to get the actual number of things that you're driving from this channel that really impressive is just too hard, in all honesty. You have to do some sort of extrapolation. So I said we've used two broad approaches, and it depends on the context and the brand and the budget and things. But your geo holdouts can work, so you can do some sort of kind of inference between two cities or two regions or something like that. And you can use that really to test your messaging and your audience targeting and various other things. And doing a proper A/B test, but bear in mind, you're restricting your inventory, you're restricting your audience to be able to make extrapolations from that. You know, trying to say this is my exact return on ad spend with something as complex as marketing is really, really hard. We think we struggle with it in B2B stuff. You know, we look at things like cost per leads and various other things. Already we know that those are a little bit all over the place. So trying to do it with B2C companies is really, really difficult. But yeah, A/B tests and geo holdouts are the only ways that we've managed to get anywhere near that. And even then, we're having a certain level of extrapolation.
Okay, we've got another question here. This one from Matt. If you are attempting a simpler, more directional measurement approach towards improvement, how do you avoid making decisions biased by external factors? In the example given, you know, penalizing a channel that maybe performed poorly in March before people knew about coronavirus's impact on the economy, how do you control for those external factors?
I haven't got a really good answer to this other than context everything. Context is that, of course it is. This is why we need people to be doing this job, otherwise it would just be machines doing it. So having the context of the wider things, understanding, you know, not just that, you know, honestly, that simple metric of just, you know, led a sale, but okay, what's actually happening in the campaign? Where are they driving people to in terms of my site? What are the actions that people are taking? Understanding that context is really important to make informed decisions. And I would just say avoid the single metric being used to compare. Obviously, if one's got a really great CPA, the one's got a really terrible CPA, that kind of tells you something. Go one level deeper, look at what's really going there. Just change the CPA model up a little bit, compare, try and find out, you know, what the differences are. So your context everything. Unfortunately, that one single metric that's perfect in all instances does not exist. I don't think it's ever going to exist. And so, yeah, certainly bear in mind the context, the external factors, the shifts in those portfolio effects over time as a result of those external factors are really important, and apply common sense. You know, you're all humans, I hope, and you spend time on the internet, you get exposed to ads, you understand what you're going to different places to do. You know, you have to apply that level of common sense rather than being blinded by data.
All right, we got another one from Shane here. I'm back in, talking about something that's top of mind for, I'm sure, a lot of folks on the webinar today, the post-cookie world. And with us transitioning towards that post-cookie world, the question is, what do you feel are maybe safer metrics to track as other metrics such as CPA may see some continued drop in trackability?
Yeah, I think it's hard. In all honesty, I think clicks are terrible. Well, clicks are not terrible in some channels, but I think they're terrible when you're trying to, you know, certainly do something like display or video and, you know, in-stream, all that kind of stuff. Just because not people aren't there to click. So I do think that we're going to end up with, and you're starting to see this already happen. In fact, if I go back to my slide that I skipped through a bit earlier, we're starting to do this, and a lot of other people are starting to do this as well. You've seen Google very quietly roll in their ad server also started to switch towards a probabilistic approach to being able to attribute, right? So that's, you know, CPA metrics are useful metrics. The model's wrong, doesn't mean it's not useful. And this here is conversion rate, which is effectively analogous to kind of a CPA type metric. And you're starting to see people, instead of using third-party cookies to do this, to use probabilistic approaches, by which we mean you can probabilistically tell it's the same person who saw this ad on Forbes and then went and checked out on Progressive, right? And I can say, look, I'm 99% certain it's the same person because they had the same browsing, they browsed the same types of sites, the same IP address, that kind of stuff. You're not certain, it's not deterministic, but you can make an informed bet. And this other person, I'm 95% certain. As long as you bear the probability in mind as you're aggregating this information, you can start to adjust, right? So I can start to adjust not just my third-party cookie coverage, which is diminishing all the time, but I can use these probabilistic approaches. And you can, and in aggregate, as long as you're robust in your statistics, you can get much better insight into what's going on. Right, so certainly this is the approach that we've been taking. This is why we built our own ad server, because we couldn't get another ad server to do it for us. But applying this probabilistic approach, and this is this in action. As I say, Safari's conversion rate looks a lot lower, and it's the green line, than the